So you're all very welcome today to the Gasyard Wall Féile, and I'm Siobhan O'Neill. I'm the interim mental health champion for Northern Ireland, and I'm delighted today to have Professor Rory OConnor with me to talk about his new book on suicide prevention. So just for some background, Rory's from Derry. He's a Derry man, and he's currently working at the University of Glasgow, and he runs a suicide research lab and has been working in this area for many, many years, and is really recognised to be one of the world's leading experts in suicide prevention. So it is really a privilege to have him here today and to get the insight and to be able to discuss this wonderful book, which is beside my bed, and there's all sorts of notes because I'm using it lots when I'm talking to people about this issue. So you're very welcome, Rory, and thanks for taking the time to come and talk to us today. So hello, and do you want to tell us about the book? Why did you write this book? Where did it all
Well, hold on, slow down, Siobhan. Let's get
okay.
I'll say a few introductions first. No, I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I would say as a native of Derry, I'm really, really pleased to be doing this event with you, Siobhan, in particular. As you know, Siobhan and I know each other for many years, are both psychologists and both trained in Queen's University in Belfast. And Siobhan likes to tell this story that obviously I'm older than her, and it's when I was doing my PhD in Queen's in psychology, Siobhan was one of the undergraduate students, but only I think a year below me. I think Siobhan, I think it was, or 2 years maybe max. And it's but anyway, so we've known each other since then, and it's been great to see obviously the work that Siobhan has been doing. Obviously, really vital work, not only in the research end of things, and whereas like leading the sort of the work on suicide and mental health more generally, and post-traumatic stress in other areas in Northern Ireland, as part of really large international collaborations I know Siobhan has been leading on. But also more recently, I've been absolutely delighted to see the work on, obviously, that you've been doing as the interim mental health champion. So I'm really, really, really pleased to be here today, as Siobhan said, talking about my new book. It seems it's coming out the wrong way around in mine. But when you put yours up there, Siobhan, yours comes up the right way.
So it's wrong on mine now.
That's bizarre. So I must have the flipping thing, or my Zoom must have the flipping bits. Anyway, for those, so the book's entitled "When It's Darkest: Why People Die by Suicide and What We Can Do to Prevent It." And as Siobhan said, I've been working in this area for some time, and so I've been working in the field of suicide research. I started my PhD, as I said already, at Queen's in Belfast in 1994, completed it in 1997. My PhD was on suicide, and I suppose ever since then, my research career has been really focused on trying to understand suicide and use that understanding then to develop interventions which hopefully will help those who are particularly vulnerable. And I suppose I've also been really fortunate and honoured over the years. I've been involved in lots of national and international organisations tasked with suicide prevention, and I am the current president of the International Association for Suicide Prevention. I think the first, UK holder of that post in about 50 years, and that's an honour to hold that role. And what we're trying to do in YASPR, the International Association for Suicide Prevention, is really bring together, share our knowledge, but bring together all advocates in terms of suicide prevention. That includes people who lived and living experience of suicide, academics, policymakers, everybody in national and international organizations. So I suppose with that sort of introduction to the sort of my background, Siobhan, you just now getting to the question I think you asked some minutes ago.
There's going to be a lot of this, isn't there? I think. Conversation. Anyway, go on. Why did you write the book? Who's it for?
Well, I suppose that one of the things I'm really passionate about in the work that I do is making sure that the research that my group and I and others do in terms of understanding and preventing suicide, it doesn't stay just within ivory towers of academia, and that it's such an important topic area. And obviously, I can't think of a more important, arguably, but I think it's the most important sort of public health question out there. Suicide is in some countries in the UK, and some statistics, suicide is a leading cause of death of men in their middle years and midlife. Suicide is the second leading cause of young people, both boys and girls, depending which age groups you look at. And the devastation of suicide is vast. I mean, we estimate there's about 800,000 people each year who will die by suicide. Work in the United States suggests that something like for every suicide, there's about 135 people potentially affected. So if you do the mathematics on that, that's just vast numbers of people who are directly or indirectly bereaved or affected by suicide. And I suppose the reason I wanted to write the book is that it's that part of that moving beyond the ivory towers and recognizing that this is such an important public health issue. And obviously in Derry, it's such a big issue as well, and in Northern Ireland more generally. Is for me, it's about getting that knowledge out there, and part of getting the knowledge of understanding suicide and what we can all do to prevent suicide is about challenging the myths and challenging people's fears. Because as somebody who's worked in the area, and as you will also well know as well, Siobhan, I mean, the fear around talking about suicide, the fear that people have of if a friend or a family member or a colleague dies by suicide, what do you say? Because your fear is that you'll say the wrong thing and you'll make matters worse. So with this book, what I was trying to do was help people understand the complexity around suicide, understand the factors that lead to suicide, but dispel the myths around suicide. So for me, what I've tried to do is combine people's personal stories around suicide, and that's including my own story of my own mental health, my own bereavements to suicide, as well as the evidence about what we all have been trying to do in terms of understanding and preventing suicide. So that part of that is in, so I think knowledge is power, obviously, in that sense, and it's helping people recognize that actually, if you've lost a loved one to suicide, or if you've been suicidal yourself, or a family member has attempted suicide, that you're not alone. I think that's a really important message, is that the feelings and fears and anxieties that we all have are anxieties which are shared, sadly, by many countless people up and down the country. So part of the aim of the book is really to help people understand and then maybe equip them with, all of us, with a sense that if we have been personally affected, that there's hope out there. As if you've been bereaved by suicide, things do get better. My God, it's difficult. It's really, really difficult. But part of it, of recognizing how things move forward, and then also harnessing maybe that pain and suffering that all of us have experienced for the good, and so that we can help others. So what I really hope I've done, and certainly the feedback I've had thus far has been really positive. I was really frightened when I remember the night before the book was published, going, what have I done here? Because it's not a traditional book on suicide, as I've said already. It brings together personal stories, my own story. And that was very, very anxiety provoking, because it's very putting the vulnerable side of me out there. And I hope by doing that, and again, the feedback thus far has suggested I hopefully managed to do that, is that it speaks to people. It doesn't matter if you're an academic, a loved one, somebody working the front line, or just somebody who's really, really wants to understand themselves or other people who might die by suicide. That's what I've tried to do with the book.
And no, I do think you've achieved it, Rory. I mean, for me, I would describe this as a book. It's full of stories, but the academic, the research base, the evidence base is there. What you're doing is showing how suicide happens, and really applying all the research that you've done and all the understanding that we now have about suicide, applying that and presenting it in a series of case studies, nearly, or little snippets. And then talking about your own personal experience, because we all have experiences, and this is so authentically you. And I think when I started to read it, I was reading it in my head, but I could hear your voice all the way through it. It was like you were reading it to me. It was really from you, which is brilliant, and it should be really accessible for people, from all sorts of different walks of life, for that reason, because it's a series of stories and we can all relate to aspects of those stories, but it makes the academic stuff really real.
Yeah.
I think it's really good, and people will learn from it in that sense, but they won't realize they're learning, because it's just so fascinating as well. It's just really interesting.
No, I'm really pleased you said that, because I think that's sort of what I did try to do in that bit about learning without knowing you're learning, in that, because what I've tried to do is sort of embed messages in people's stories and people's narratives, and use that as a way of illustrating how, so for example, as you know, that sort of the backbone of the book is this model of suicide I've developed. So I've developed this theoretical model called the integrated motivational volitional model, or the IMV model of suicide. And it's my attempt to help people understand the sort of pathways to suicide. And so that if you can understand those pathways, I don't know if people can hear, there's an airplane. I live on the flight path in Glasgow. And one of the great things about the pandemic has been that it's been pretty quiet, but now the airplanes are starting to come back again. So sorry, so that's really gratifying to hear that you say that, because yes, because what I was trying to do was, as I was writing the book, because what I would do, it was a sort of bizarre way of, well, not bizarre, I don't know if that's bizarre, but when I was writing the book, what I would do is I would just sit down each night, because I was obviously my day job to do anyway. And so during the pandemic, most nights in late summer, autumn, winter of last year, and most nights I would sit down and literally I would have a couple of words of to summarize what I would hope to write that day. And I just plan that I would write a minimum of 500 words a day, and hopefully, and try not to worry about what those words were or how good they were, because I thought giving myself that sense of a target would often get me over the sort of the hump of what am I really going to say. But when I sort of had set myself those boundaries, and then I had to sort of give myself the freedom to just write about when I thought I'm going to try and combine this personal and professional, then those narratives that you touch on, they would just emerge when I start writing. I would then remember somebody I'd met, or one of the honors of working in this field is I get a lot of correspondence from people, and I've done a lot of documentaries on suicide, and on the back of those documentaries or public engagement events, people would drop me emails or write to me, and I was remembering a lot of those, even right back to the early days when I was in Belfast. And I think I'll talk about one case of family, a really heartbreaking letter I got from a family when I was at Queen's in Belfast after, I think it was a UTV Live. It was Linda Bryan's, who was the first person who interviewed me about the work I did on suicide as a PhD student. But I remember getting this letter, a heartbreaking letter from a family, and from some rural part of Northern Ireland. But what that was, it's just an example. I'm sort of going off tangent here, but it just was a story of a family who'd been absolutely devastated. But their devastation was linked to, they felt that they'd let their community down, they let their son down, they thought they brought shame on the family. And that really brought home to me at that early stage was, and that's a really important point I think to think about, is still the stigma around suicide, the stigma around mental health and the consequences of it. Now, but it's funny how those stories stay with you. And I suppose when I was writing the book, what was really liberating was, I suppose there's lots of stuff in my career I haven't really processed in terms of every single day dealing with suicide and death and the work that I do. And I suppose the book gave me this unexpected opportunity to just see what bubbled up in terms of memories of people I've met or my own personal experiences of bereavement. And I suppose then using those stories as a way of conveying hopefully messages, either messages of conveying or dispelling some of the myths. So one of the myths I talk about in the book is asking somebody about suicide will plant the idea in their head. And that is a complete myth. And the reality is, in some cases, by just directly asking somebody, if you're concerned about somebody, asking them whether they're suicidal, and doing it in a way which is compassionate, but doing it in a way in which you don't want the answer to be no, you're open to the answer being yes. And if you're open to that answer, to the possibility that answer is yes, somebody who may be struggling, who may be suicidal, is much more likely to say that they are suicidal. And so the idea is that asking that question certainly doesn't plant the idea of suicide in their head, but it could be the start of a life-saving conversation. That's something I've been saying a lot since the book has come out, is we're trying to harness opportunities to start life-saving conversations. Now, suicide prevention is so much more than life-saving conversations, but it's a start, and that's what's really, really important. And again, that's what I've tried to do, is have those messages so that even if you don't remember some of the science, some of the research studies I talk about in the book, you might remember somebody's narrative, somebody's story somebody's story which resonates with you, because it might be somebody like you. It might be somebody like your father, your mother, your brother, or your sister.
I think that's so important, and that's a good take-home message for today as well, is it's always okay to ask about suicide, and we've got to be in a position where we can be comfortable with that answer being yes, because many of us have suicidal thoughts. I think one of the studies we did showed that nearly 1 in 10 people in Northern Ireland have seriously considered suicide, and depending on how you ask that question, you'll get a different range of responses. So it's very normal to question the meaning of your life, and those suicidal thoughts, as something that doesn't mean you need to end your life, that something needs to change. I think that's a big point. And there's lots of help out there to help you change what it is that needs to change. But to acknowledge that and to be okay with someone expressing suicidal thoughts, I think is a really, really important thing. And then getting them help, obviously, and helping them sort everything out. So, and we know that many people who've had suicidal thoughts go on to live really nice lives and are really glad that they're still alive and they haven't acted on those thoughts. In fact, most people do, so those are key points, I think, that the research is telling us, and you get that across really, really well in the book.
But just on that point, Siobhan, I think it's really important to reinforce that, just that last point you made there, is it's the overwhelming majority of people who are in a suicidal crisis recover. And I know that's scant comfort if you're lost a loved one to suicide. But I suppose that my message is to people who are struggling, or if you have a family member who's struggling, who is suicidal. We know often that there is, a period of crisis, and that crisis can last weeks or months. And in that depths of that crisis, if you're somebody in the depths of that crisis, you think things will never get better, and that you're a burden on those around you, and the world would be a better place if you were not in it. And one of the things we know from all the research is that, we want to get through that crisis. For most people, that recovery happens. And so there will be bumps in the road, and people may obviously experience other difficulties. And maybe if they've got treatment or support, initially it may not work, it may take time. And I suppose it's that message of hope that in that darkest of places, and hence the name of the book, when it's darkest, in the darkest, it can be so difficult to see that future, to see beyond that, those moments of crisis. And again, if I bring it back to my model of suicide, so my model of suicide, the IMV model, at the heart of it is this idea that people who die by suicide or become suicidal, it's not that they want to die necessarily, but rather they want this pain to end. And that sense of mental pain, I talk about this sense of being trapped by mental pain, this mental entrapment. And that mental entrapment, and it manifests itself in different ways, but it's that sense in which maybe you feel that you feel defeated by life, or you feel humiliated, or you feel the sense of rejection or loss, and that can be triggered by a whole host of things. In particular, we know there's a lot of work on early life trauma, and that's a really important one, I think, when we think about the context of Northern Ireland. And although the Good Friday Agreement was that 1998, but obviously many, many years ago, and there's been relative peace. But as we know by what's going on currently in Derry and in Northern Ireland, obviously it's been really in the news in the last couple of weeks with obviously the protocol and all of those things, which are all part of the narrative and the challenges of dealing with the legacy of the Troubles, the legacy of that trauma. And even though the trauma for many is in the past, it can be, and you've done lots of work on this, Siobhan, and we did a little bit, I was a bit involved in the intergenerational report, the trauma report, but that's so important. And I remember even linking to when we did a few years ago, the adolescent self-harm work in schools in Northern Ireland. And I remember speaking to some of the head teachers going, oh, but these kids we had questions about the exposure to the Troubles. I remember at the time, this was like in the mid 2000s, I think we were doing this research. I remember a head teacher saying to my research team, oh, but don't be asking about the Troubles. These kids were all born after the Good Friday Agreement was signed. So of course they won't know anything about this. And on our data, I said, well, you can't forget about the intergenerational bit. And indeed, our research did show that those young people who told us they'd seen riots or they'd lost loved ones to the Troubles, that they were more likely to self-harm, these adolescents, 15 and 16-year-olds. So I think when we think about the context, the context of suicide in Northern Ireland, it's so important that we don't forget that we're still dealing with the legacy of the Troubles. And that as somebody who was brought up in Derry but hasn't lived there for many years, I'm always reluctant to comment on what the context of Northern Ireland, but it's clear as day from all the evidence and all the work that you do, Siobhan, and Siobhan obviously led on this review we published. Was that 2 years ago, before the pandemic or during the pandemic?
We were trying to get it out for IASP in 2019, and it was 2020, so it was just at the start, maybe.
Yeah, may have come out to the start of the pandemic, but the review obviously really highlighted the complex set of factors associated with suicide in Northern Ireland, and they added, in addition to inequalities, because one of the things we know from looking across the world and Scotland, and I mean, I obviously live in Scotland, that the inequalities gradient, so people are much more likely to die by suicide from more socially disadvantaged backgrounds. So we need to do that, and I hate to use this term leveling up, but that idea of basically ensuring that the mental health gradient, the suicide gradient, is so steep, going from socially disadvantaged through to more affluent. Now, that's not to say that people from affluent backgrounds don't kill themselves, because sadly, suicide isn't choosy in that sense. It affects all of us. But I think there's an onus. It's an absolute disgrace that we live in a country in the UK and in Ireland where you still have this huge inequalities gradient. And if our politicians are serious, it has to prioritize tackling at the heart of suicide prevention is tackling inequalities. And part of that tackling inequalities is having equal access to services, and services that are tailored to the needs of people who are most vulnerable.
Totally, I couldn't agree more. Our mental health strategies come out. It's not a cross-departmental strategy. It needed to be put out quite quickly for various different reasons from the Department of Health. But Action 2 is a plan to reduce the social determinants of mental health. That's early intervention and prevention, a 10-year plan. It's got to be cross-departmental, and it's got to be focused on reducing the impact of inequalities and reducing inequalities themselves, because that's what, it leads to that pain that you're talking about, Rory. And one of your other talks, you talked about, we need to think about, where is that psychological pain coming from? What's causing that? And poverty and the stress of poverty. And also the idea of the troubles being in the past. I mean, we're recording this in the week that Boris Johnson has announced, that he's going to draw a line under the troubles. And of course, we know, we live this every day. You don't draw a line over something that is so important. It's part of your life. It's how you live your life. It's, we don't necessarily, and many people do, but most of us don't see violence every day, but we're still living with the after effects of that. So what we've got here in Northern Ireland is those inequalities, but an overlapping of trauma and trauma exposure, which has changed how the body and brain respond to stress. And that in itself is a stressor. Living with trauma as a stressor, that causes pain, that causes the type of psychological pain that you're talking about, that can increase the risk of suicide and increase suicidal behavior. And that's one of the things that's so important about your model. It differentiates between the causes of the pain and then the factors that lead to the behavior. So maybe you could tell us more about that.
Yeah, so I'll move on to the thoughts versus suicidal actions thing, or suicidal behavior, in a second, but actually just remind me, so often it's a case of something, which is the importance of trauma-informed care and support. And I think that one of the things that it can be very difficult for us. So if you haven't experienced trauma, it can be sometimes difficult to really appreciate the impact on how people experience trauma form relationships, how they trust people, and then that has an impact on the likelihood of them seeking help. And I think it's so important that when we're thinking of all services, and I talk about services to prevent suicide, I'm not just talking about mental health services. You already mentioned this cross-departmental approach in government, and that's so vitally important. But I'm thinking in schools, I'm thinking in the workplace, I'm thinking anywhere we all interact, that we recognize that if somebody's experienced trauma, how that manifests itself could be, as I said already, that you don't trust other people, you don't trust adults, you don't disclose information, that you feel it, that services aren't for them, and you feel a sense often of you're not worth worth people speaking to you or the services. So it's really vital that we do move. And I know you and others and your colleagues are doing that in terms of trauma-informed responses, but I think it's really important that we highlight that. But then go back to your question, Siobhan, about obviously thoughts versus actions. So one of the things I've tried to do in my research career is, for me, there are 2 or 3 key questions we need to answer to prevent suicide. I'll start with 2. First one is, what is it that leads somebody to become suicidal in the first place? So that's question number 1. And then question 2 is, what is it that makes it more likely that somebody who's thoughts of suicide, I describe it in the book as crosses a precipice from thinking about suicide to acting on their thoughts, or sadly dying by suicide. And then there's a third question, is what you then can do to alleviate both answers to question 1 and the answer to question 2. So in my model, AMD model, what the argument is, it's so suicidal thoughts, as I've said already, suicidal thoughts emerge when you feel this sense of feelings of defeat and humiliation from which you cannot escape. So that sense of entrapment. Now, but for us to understand the emergence of defeat and humiliation and entrapment, you put it quite nicely a few minutes ago, Siobhan. You asked, well, where does that come from? And I think that comes from lots of different sources. And you talked about the pain or the suffering of poverty and the stress of poverty. That's one angle, of course it is. But then there's also we think of other minority groups in our society, people from the LGBTQ plus community. We know that the minority stress associated with their sexual identities is huge, and in the trans community, there's another really important group of people who've been overlooked for years and years. But we also look at focus on young people for a second, because the sad reality is, pre-pandemic, the suicide rates have started to increase across the UK, and there was a worrying increase amongst young people. Now, we don't quite know the answer to that part of it. We'll come back to maybe social media, because I think it gets blamed for everything, and I think that's a wrong way of viewing things. But what coming to my head in other risk groups is neurodiverse groups. So there's growing recognition, and we've been doing some work recently with Sarah Cassidy, who's now at Nottingham University, and Simon Baron-Cohen on young people who are autistic, and that there seems to be evidence now that that's a group of young people who are vulnerable, who've been hidden, because we don't record in suicide statistics in terms of other characteristics. We don't record their sort of neurodevelopmental profile, or whether they've had a diagnosis of autism, and so that's another group of people at risk. And then if you think about the pandemic, although thankfully thus far the data are broadly reassuring that although suicidal thoughts we think have increased during the pandemic, that hasn't, certainly the lockdown phases of pandemic, that hasn't been translated yet thankfully into increased suicide rates. But we need to be really, really cautious in the interpretation of the pandemic data so far, because it hasn't done any fine-grained deep dive in subgroups. So that, going back to young people, we've data showing that young people's mental health has been really adversely affected in the pandemic. So as a group of people, I think we know in research terms, we would talk about cohort effects. So our concern is moving forward. Women have been really adversely affected, we know, from the pandemic in their mental health. In terms of jobs lost, much more likely to be affected by women, more likely to have lost their jobs than men. And those professions which have been affected, the caring and the hospitality sectors, are much more likely to be women in them, and young women as well. So there's a whole load of stuff going on there, my concern. And then another group I think we need to really focus in on is people who have pre-existing mental health problems. And again, all the evidence suggests, and again, from our data, I run the UK mental health and well-being tracker study, and we've loads of evidence now that people with pre-existing mental health problems, young people, women, and those from more socially disadvantaged backgrounds have been more adversely affected by the pandemic. So it's really important that we remain vigilant moving forward. Now, I've sort of forgotten why I was bringing that up, but I was talking about the importance of women's thinking about the emergence of suicidal thoughts. When we're trying to understand that sense of entrapment, we need to look at it in a fine-grained way. What are the stressors on individuals, on particular individuals, to increase a sense of entrapment? Or what happens, an example I include in the book is that people, and sadly too many people I've met who have attempted suicide or self-harmed, have gone to the emergency department and felt that they haven't been treated as human beings, they haven't been treated with a sense of compassion. So that sense of being treated not like a human being or without compassion, all that does then is compound the sense of entrapment, compound the sense of worthlessness. And so what we need to do at all levels of society is think about what our actions are doing at government level, at a community level, at an individual level, that we're basically, what we should be trying to do is promote a sense of worth, that you have a sense of worth or self-esteem, which will then hopefully protect against entrapment, promote things which protect somebody from feeling defeated or humiliated or being rejected. because they're all part of this pathway that leads us to become suicidal or feel trapped and then become suicidal. And that sense of being a burden on yourself or on society or on your community. So we need to really work hard at doing that. And one of the things in Scotland we've been doing as we're thinking about our next 10 years of our suicide prevention action plan and new strategy is, how can we, across departments, target defeat, target entrapment, target humiliation? So when you're thinking about outcomes for a suicide prevention strategy, of course, you need to look at reducing suicide and reducing suicidal behavior. But how you do that is targeting these other intermediate targets like defeat and humiliation and entrapment. And then, so then I'll just move on then, sorry, Siobhan, to the bits about going from thoughts to actions. So thankfully, most people who thoughts of suicide don't act on their thoughts. And although it's really difficult to get an accurate estimate of what percentage of people who think about suicide make that transition from thinking to acting on their thoughts, to attempting suicide, or sadly dying by suicide, we think is about a third of people. Work that Matt Knock and others have led in the World Mental Health Survey estimates, we think it's about a third of people make that transition. And so what I describe in the model in this Crossing the Precipice chapter is this part of my model, which is called the volitional phase. And the volitional phase is trying to understand what are the factors that increase the likelihood that if somebody thinks about suicide, they make that transition from thoughts to acts of suicide. And in the model I talk about, I outline 8 factors in the model, which I'm going to try and just show people. I'm going to see if I can quickly find it in my book. Yeah, so I outline, don't worry if you can't see this, but I outline 8 factors, which I call these volitional moderators or volitional factors effectively, or pillars of behavioral action. And people won't be able to see it, but I'm just showing you there's a nice figure in the book. And that figure identifies, and Siobhan's identified as well, which is good. And the figure identifies these 8 pillars of what I describe as behavioral inaction. And what that simply means is that if you're suicidal and you have any of these factors, it increases the likelihood you'll make that transition from thinking to acting on your thoughts. And they include things like, we know that if you've got access to the means of suicide, you've ready access to the way in which you thought about ending your life, unsurprisingly, you're much more likely to act on your thoughts. And that's why it's so important. I also have a full chapter on safety planning. And safety planning is this brief intervention in which it helps us work collaboratively with somebody who's suicidal to basically keep their environment safe. So we can think about what the triggers are to them maybe becoming, or triggers or warning signs to them becoming suicidal, and then keep the environment safe. So maybe making sure they don't have access to that means of suicide. So that's one of the volitional factors which increase the likelihood somebody acts on their thoughts. And others include things like what we describe in the sort of research literature as exposure to suicide. And what we mean by exposure is simply knowing somebody else, somebody close to in your life who's died by suicide or who has attempted suicide. Because we know that if you have a loved one who's died by suicide, you're more likely to act on your thoughts of suicide. Now, it's really important I put the caveat, is that the overwhelming majority of people who've lost a loved one to suicide will never become suicidal and will never ever die by suicide or attempt suicide. But it is a risk factor. And so it's really important if you know somebody who is having suicidal thoughts, it's really important to check in whether they've a family member or a friend who has either died by suicide or attempted suicide, because it makes it much more, we describe as this cognitive accessibility, makes it more likely that somebody may be thinking about. So again, it's an important thing to think about as this sort of understanding this transition from thinking to attempting suicide. I'll just mention one other. There's 8 of them, but I won't go through all of them today. Please read the book and there'll be more details, and hopefully it is helpful. So there's one other is mental imagery. And so what mental imagery is, we know that people who die by suicide will have thought about it before they have attempted suicide usually. But we also think if you have actually pictured yourself either dying or dead, that you're much more likely to act on your thoughts. And it's a bit like when we think about mental imagery in any other context. So in the book, I talk about mental imagery in the context of sports. And we know that that basically that if you rehearse something in your head, you picture yourself in your head, you're much more likely to act on your thoughts. And suicide, remember, is first and foremost a behavior. It's something that somebody does. So even if we're doing mental rehearsal and we're picturing ourselves that in our head, we're much more likely to act on our thoughts. So again, that's another thing to think about if you're concerned about a loved one. Now, it's really also important to highlight that if somebody is having thoughts of suicide and you're talking to them about their suicidal thoughts, really what you're trying to do is get them in a place where hopefully will reach out for help, either to a GP or to a mental health professional, or call a crisis line. Obviously in Northern Ireland, there's Lifeline. And so it's important we do that. So in the book, although what I'm trying to do in the book is help you have a better understanding, increase the likelihood that you will reach out and help somebody else, or help you deal with your own distress, or manage the fact that maybe you've lost a loved one to suicide. But it's recognizing that suicide prevention is a team effort. We all have some bits of that role to play, so always, if you are concerned that somebody is at imminent risk of harming themselves, and you think that if they think they cannot keep themselves safe, please contact the emergency services, especially if, for example, they have exposure to suicide. If they've got a plan in place, if somebody's got a plan of how they'll end their life, that's another volitional factor, and we can't keep them safe, that's urgent. Please act immediately.
Okay, and just some useful numbers. Lifeline are here 24 hours a day. Northern Ireland's quite unusual that we have a bespoke suicide prevention helpline. They do also offer counselling, and you know, I speak to people all the time who've used their services. They really are great, and that's on 0808 808 8000. Samaritans are also the suicide prevention experts, 116 123, 24 hours a day. So contact Lifeline or Samaritans. And in fact, what I've done in the past is phone them with the person. Stick the phone on speaker and just ring them up. And again, practice and calling a helpline. For the first time when you do it, it's really scary. So when you're in that state of crisis, it's not natural to pull out your phone and take this leap of faith. But if you've gone through that process before with somebody, that can be quite a helpful thing to do. Unfortunately, a lot of the conversation around suicide, Rory, that I've seen in the study as well, emphasizes the mental imagery and gives people the imagery and uses images of the deceased and stories of how the suicide happened and the methods that were used. And again, you can see now whenever you put that against what your model is suggesting, you can see how that can be very unhelpful and might actually lead people when they're in a crisis to develop those kind of scripts of what they need to do. And people do enact those suicide scripts like a storyline. They imagine what they would do, where they would go, and how they would do it, rather than how they would get help and how they would get through it. You know, so I'm always talking about the media coverage of suicide in our study specifically. So do you want to touch on that again? How the media is effectively interacting with access to a method can actually be harmful.
Yeah, you've done great work on this, Siobhan. I think it's a really fine line between promoting the discussion around suicide. I think that's really important that we promote discussion so more people will get the help and support that they need. But we need to be careful that that's done in an appropriate and a safe way. So what we're saying here, we're not trying to censor people and censor the media. What we're trying to say is it has to be done in a way which is responsible reporting, because we do know from the research evidence, especially, for example, on celebrity suicides, that you see an increase in suicide of about 10 to 12% in the weeks after the media coverage. So that really highlights that we're not just scaremongering for the sake of scaremongering. This is important about saving people's lives. And part of the recommendations are media guidelines about how one should talk about suicide. And crucial to that is we shouldn't be glamorizing suicide, and we should not be talking about the method in detail. And in the book, for example, when I was describing stories in the book, I don't go into detail about any methods or anything like that. And I think that's really, really important. So it's finding that balance. And that's also really difficult area about memorials, about suicide memorials is really, really difficult, especially on media, because of course you want to honor the life of a loved one, but we have to do it in a way which is safe and is not increasing risk in others. So absolutely. And again, as you say, it's in terms of my model, that's sort of, if that's inappropriate reporting, it increases sadly the likelihood if somebody else is vulnerable and they've got a script and a plan in place, they're more likely to act on their thoughts of suicide. Absolutely. So, no, totally. And what we should be thinking about doing when we're working with the media is, so again, I described this in the book, that work that has been done in Austria, Thomas Niedenthal-Heider. Thomas is the longest. Yeah, it's the longest name in the world. I was talking about this earlier. Thomas, a good colleague and friend, but Thomas has done work on what he describes. He's coined this term, the Papageno effect, and what he's trying to do is help work, and he's demonstrated this in sort of research. He's trying to get the media to present messages of hope. So when they're reporting suicide and cases of suicide, talk about stories of recovery, highlight the fact that suicide isn't the solution to your pain, and that there are other ways of getting help and support, and basically and also highlighting the complexity. So there's just 3 different things that he's doing there: hope and recovery, how you can, suicide isn't the option, there are other options, and that basically, of course, you don't go into details of method and so on. And I think that's what I would like to see more of our discussions around, how we, when we're talking about suicide, thinking about all those stories of so many people who have gone through a crisis, and I think you mentioned this already, and they live completely fulfilling lives, and they're now strong advocates of suicide prevention. At the time, they couldn't see that, but on reflection, they can now. Such an important topic, and again, but it is, in general, I would say that media reporting has got so much better over the years, but we still haven't worked out how we really properly deal with social media. And Samaritans and the International Association for Suicide Prevention, we've got guidance on this, and Thomas and other colleagues, and we've got these special interest groups, and there's a special interest group about media reporting and how we deal with the media, and that's something we need to be working on day in and day out. And that applies to local media as well as national media, of course.
It also applies to how we discuss it on Facebook and things ourselves, and whether we're showing pictures and what are we saying, or are we really trying to prevent suicide and how we deal with it. But no, there's a local angle on this as well, because many people watching this will be familiar with John Deary and the Heads, a local band. And John Deary recently completed his PhD. He's a filmmaker as well, and his PhD was on the Papageno effect, and he worked with Thomas to create a piece of film that was, that included all the elements of that. So, we have an expert in our city on the Papageno effect, and I think that's just so exciting as well. So
yeah,
I want to get to, it's cool. I must put you in touch with him. And
I know John. I know. So
he was that I asked, but it would be good to talk to John as part of one of these things as well.
It would be. It would be. He's got a copy of my book, because he messaged me and said, would I send him a signed copy? And he then agreed to. I said, of course I would, and he donated them to one of the local mental health charities in Derry.
Brilliant. I paid for my copy, just to say. Okay, I didn't get a free copy, wasn't offered a free copy. I got it from I thought, will not say where I got it.
My mother got a free copy. In Derry. But actually, it's pleased to see my cousin Kira O'Connor in Derry. She Instagrammed me the other day to say that the book, she sent me a photograph of the book. Is it a bookshop called, an independent bookshop called Acorn?
Yeah, Little Acorns in Derry. They have it, do they?
They've got it. So she sent me photos. I was delighted to see that. So
brilliant. So people should go there to get it rather than the A place that I got mine. But I just needed it really quickly when it was released. So,
Yeah, well, wherever. Definitely support, as far as possible, independent
more local booksellers. Absolutely. And when are you doing the Audible version, Rory? I want to hear you.
So I'm in basically discussion with a couple of companies. Hopefully I've been in some correspondence. So I'm hoping that we'll hear. I'm hoping there'll be good news and getting that out. I really hope. So I can't confirm that yet.
That would be lovely to have you read it in your voice as well, because anyway, I'm digressing all over the place. I have 2 things I want to talk to you about, because we are coming near to the end of our wee section here.
What we do? We're going to do. We've another 15 minutes, have we? What do we say? 45 to
I have as long as it takes. Yeah.
Well, we can do it. Well, we'll see how you get on with these 2 questions, and we'll finish definitely within 15 minutes, just because I think we'll try and keep it within the hour.
Okay, so they can cut all that bit out or include it or whatever.
Yeah, leave it in. That's a bit. That's like it's almost like in real life. Because the other thing is, I was hoping. I did explore whether I could come to Derry and we could do this in Derry, and then I couldn't get flights to work because I'm going on leave and so on. But anyway, sorry, Siobhan, you have a couple of comments or questions?
Well, I wanted to talk to you. You threw in social media very casually earlier, right? And this is a lot of parents are watching this. You know, the kids are on the iPads constantly or whatever devices they're using, and you know, there's a lot of hysteria about it. And yet, in Northern Ireland, there's actually been a debate about young people's access to phones at schools, and some schools banning them completely, and all of this stuff. And I have my own view on this, obviously, but I'd just like to get your sense, because there's a lot of different angles on it.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk about that? And then I want to talk about how we look after ourselves, Rory, because, you know, I think that's really important when we're doing this sort of research, and everybody that's watching this is here for a reason, and we know that. So those are the two topics that I want to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, no, they're great. The social media one, I think, as you know as well as Siobhan, it's not clear cut at all. And I suppose I get quite annoyed about reading headlines in which social media is blamed as it's seemingly the sole solution, the sole cause of all the ills in society, including suicide and mental health. Now, of course, like any other activity, if you do it in moderation, it's usually fine. And the challenge is, the added challenge I think with social media in the context of suicide is, if somebody is already vulnerable, is already distressed, or has already experienced trauma, or bullying in the real world, for example, and when I say the real world, I mean face-to-face, then of course, if they're experiencing distressing material online, of course that's going to have an impact on them. But I touch on, I've got a couple of sections of this in the book as well, and what I talk about is the research. And there's been a couple of reviews of the evidence that have been published in recent years. It's more than a couple, 2 or 3, or even more. But what they point to is two key solutions. Conclusions. Sorry. First of all, it is that, yeah, as I just said, social media, it's one small part of the puzzle of understanding suicide risk. And in some of the really large scale research, they've shown that actually social media, when you control for other factors, really it doesn't have that huge an influence. Now, but some of the qualitative research would suggest that, yeah, some people say, yeah, social media use, especially when viewing some detailed imagery, that was part of the pathway for them to maybe self-injure or to attempt suicide, or there was instances of bullying or other sort of shaming type events which contributed. And of course, that is just devastating and awful. But then there were other examples people were given in which social media was so positive, because one of the things we know, that social isolation and loneliness is often one of the many factors associated with suicide risk. And for many young people, that sense of connection, that sense of compassion that they often receive, maybe they didn't receive in the face-to-face, they got online. So that was seen as a positive protective factor. So for me, we need a really nuanced discussion. That, of course, I agree that when Instagram and other social media platforms have removed dangerous content, I'm supportive of that, because I think on balance, if it's unmoderated, vulnerable people, I think that's fine. And indeed, in the International Association for Suicide Prevention, we're working closely now with TikTok on TikTok's guidance, because obviously TikTok tend to have a younger audience than maybe some of Instagram or Twitter, or certainly Facebook, for the old people like us. But so I think it is complicated. So I wouldn't be going for blanket bans. I think we need to think about innovative ways of harnessing these platforms for the good. And indeed, I know that Facebook and Twitter and other organizations are doing that. They're now thinking of ways in which they can. So Facebook, there's a whole algorithm and so on, that if people are posting content which is concerning, they're being suicidal, behind the scenes, that they're contacted, and there's now you can agree to a friend contacting you. There's ways in which we can now use that to get the help and support to people. So, but what's your view on it, though?
Oh, no, I completely agree with you. I think at the end of the day, for me, all of this comes back to self-awareness, to recognize how your body and mind and thoughts are responding to what you're doing in social media and what's happening in social media. So if you find that it's activating that stress response, which I always talk about, that dysregulation, you know, that can turn into overwhelm. And, you know, that puts you at risk then for mental health problems. We have enough of that without having it in social media. Whereas if you're using it to make those compassionate connections, to really, and you know, with the past year of the pandemic, lots of people, that's how they've found their connections, and connection is so important, and that is regulating. So it's all about, is it helping us feel connected and regulated, and do we get any joy out of it? You know, are we getting some good out of it, or is it arousing that stress response? Is it affecting us in a negative way? And the other thing I would say is it interfering with the holy trinity: diet, sleep, exercise? You
That's
know,
exactly what I was going to say.
if you're sleeping long enough, right? If you're getting your sleep and you're doing enough exercise, and your body needs to move. Oh, I've learned this as well, and we're going to it in self-care a wee bit as well. We are designed to move as human beings. Our brain gets stressed when we're sitting like this all day, because it's not a natural state, and our animal brain is going, oh my goodness, you haven't hunted, you haven't found food, things are not right here. So if you're not getting enough exercise, or if you're not getting enough sleep, and then if you're eating mindlessly and not you know, not thinking about what you're putting into your body, and TV is, in fairness, the one that is more likely to do that. But if it's interfering with those three things, I think we need to take a serious look at how it is in our lives. But I'm not going to take it away from my bedside table at night, for example. You know, and I get a lot of good out of my phone, out of my social media. I spread messages that I hope are positive. But we need to understand too that this is not the real world, you know, that we are seeing snippets of people's lives. And that level of self-awareness, it needs to be wired into kids. We need to be wired into our veins in preschool and primary school, so that then they can use it. And, you know, once they have it, Rory, they could teach us a thing or two about what it is and what it isn't. And we have a lot to learn. I think there's many adults, you know, and thinking too, as a parent, how Annabelle is how I am. So I need to look at myself first and how I use my phone. And then, because she's looking for a tablet when I'm looking at my phone, and I mean a tablet as in an iPad, not a tablet.
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
So
No, I agree, but no.
Yeah.
No, I was going to just say the point was exactly the sleep. Anything which interferes with sleep and dysregulates sleep is absolutely awful for your mental health. And like we've done work in which we've monitored with my colleagues in Norway, and we've looked at patterns of sleep and self-harm in young people. And not only do you see a relationship, you see what we do in the science literature will describe as a dose response. You can see that the more dysregulated your sleep, the more likely you are to self-harm, or an increased risk. And there's meta-analysis that we looked at this, more likely you are to attempt suicide or die by suicide. And I think, and it's really, so when you think about it, it's like the building blocks for all our daily lives is sleep, because we need sleep to be good decision makers. We need sleep to regulate our emotions. We need sleep just to navigate our everyday lives. So of course, I mean, but it's funny because sometimes it's the most basic things we forget about. So I think it's so important that we do remind ourselves of that. And I think you're right, though, this idea of going for this prohibition type approach of, I just don't think that works, because we're all individuals, and as you say, that people get positives out of it, as well as obviously the challenges of it. And it's just thinking in a much more creative way is what we need to do. That's really good.
We've talked a wee bit about stress and trauma, and some of the evidence I've been looking at is around how sleep actually helps us process stress and lay down memories that don't come back on us as PTSD, that help us make sense of all of that. So, you know, getting enough sleep, after a night's sleep, things just shift, things feel different. You find solutions to problems. But I also think it's important to note that whenever your mental health is affected, or, you know, you're not in a really good place, you'll have difficulty sleeping. So it's a sign that something's not right as well. And it's a sign that you might need help. Because if you can't, you know, it's very hard once you think I'm not sleeping enough, and then you try to sleep, and of course you're anxious. So, you know, these are signs that things are on a slippery slope, that, you know, you might need a wee bit of support. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a reinforcing cycle and or an escalating cycle. And I think, but I suppose it comes back to this message that reaching out doesn't matter for your sleep, for your mood, whatever it is. To me, I've been saying for years, is reaching out for help, if it doesn't matter who you are, is a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness. And actually, one of the things I did in the book was I talked about, I see a therapist once a week, and I didn't do, and I started out in my early 40s. The first time in my life I ever reached out, because I was this idea, oh, I can solve all my own problems and I don't need to, whatever. That's just the model I had of myself, even though, I mean, I always talked about stuff, but I think, and part of the reason for me doing that in the book is well, because if I'm going to talk about other people's stories, that was really important to me, talk about my own story. And part of it, just what you were saying there, Siobhan, I suppose, is, I mean, it just, yeah, you're talking about the example of you doing it for Annabelle, obviously, in your phone. I'm talking more generally about trying to model to my children, obviously, as well, the importance of all reaching out for help and support. And for me, that was, everybody's solution will be different. But for me, that works very well. And it also helps me process the work that I do. And it's certainly, especially the other thing I obviously talk about in the book is the 2 bereavements by suicide in my life. And I talk a lot about Claire, a very close friend who lost her life. And that completely floored me. Obviously devastated me when it happened in 2008. But I think that I didn't try and process any of that. I don't think I really did initially. And really only started to process that properly probably when I went into therapy. And I think it's just for me, it really highlighted, I suppose I thought I had some sense of what it felt like to be bereaved by suicide. And I suppose it gives me a completely different angle or insight or understanding of what that's like and all the guilt and whatever you feel. And but I suppose I was in some ways quite fortunate, even that I was able to do a lot when Claire died, with supporting. She died in Paris and going to Paris and being with her husband, and so doing stuff like that, which I talk a lot about in the book. One of the challenges I think in bereavement is, especially if you're not a family member, is what's your role? And and a lot of people talk about this. Oh, it's this hidden, or it's hidden grief because people don't recognize it, or it's like illegitimate grief. And it's not. And indeed, and the largest ever survey, which also included people from Northern Ireland, on bereavement by suicide, spearheaded by the indomitable Sharon McDonnell in Manchester. It's over 7,000 people across the UK and Ireland completed it. But most of the people who responded, their experiences of bereavement by suicide was as friends. And I think that's something that, as communities, and a tight-knit community like Derry, I think we'll all know somebody, a friend, even if it's not a family member, a friend or a friend of a friend. And I think what I talk about in the book, in the last chapter of the book, is that aftermath of suicide. And I talk about a person I met who I was really fortunate in, and I was, in the case of Claire's death, go to Paris, spend a week with her family, help sort things out, do a memorial with Dave, her husband, and do all that stuff. So I felt useful, and I felt as if I was supporting them and each other and whatever. But I talk about a person I met then a few years ago at one of the UK bereavement conferences, and this poor lady is just devastated still, because she was really, the person who died was a college friend, and they were inseparable. But when the suicide happened, the family took over, and of course that's understandable. And she just felt completely, she had no place, and she didn't. So she just thinks her grief is so much worse because she just felt illegitimate, as her pain was illegitimate. And one of the things which comes out of Sharon McDonnell's survey, when she did 7,000 people bereaved by suicide, is it's trying to tap into that and recognize that grief doesn't matter how close you are to the individual. People distant in groups. I talked at the very start of this, I think I mentioned at the very start, the Julie Carell's work in the United States about every person who dies by suicide, we think there's potentially 135 people affected. And of those 135 people, some of them might be distant in some scale of sort of impact in terms of some representation, but it doesn't mean their grief or the pain they're experiencing is any less. Because one of the things none of us ever know is what's going on in somebody else's life, or what an event, how that may resonate in somebody. And so that sense that even if that person is distant in a friendship group, but they may have been having their own suicidal thoughts, and this brings back awful memories for them, or they've lost somebody to suicide we don't know about. So I suppose an important message is that when we're thinking about grief, and what I've tried to do in the book is remind ourselves that we all have our own story, and to understand how we relate to each other is understanding our own stories and trying not to hide that and keep that in. Always reach out for help. Please always reach out for help. Anyway, that was sort of a sidetrack. Like sorry, Siobhan.
Yeah, I don't know, but it's really important to know that you've had that feeling of grief, of desperation, of going, I had no idea. we didn't, you know, and there's so many people out there who can identify with that. You know, there's very few people who haven't lost somebody sadly in the city. We all know people, and there'll be people who are tuned into this who will know that as well. And I think it helps to know that someone like you as well has gone through that. So let's just end with how do we look after ourselves? Because, you know, we talk about exposure to suicide. My goodness, like you and me, we're talking mental health, suicide every single day.
Yeah.
Hear terrible stories and see terrible images, and you know, it's constant. So what do you do to balance that? How do you look after yourself so that you don't become dragged down by this in a way that means that you can't do your work?
Well, I think so. Again, I've reflected on this a lot for the book. Is it? I didn't do enough of that early on in my career, without a doubt. I just was on this treadmill of just keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep writing, keep publishing, all that sort of stuff you do as an academic. But I think what I've got better at doing now, and the things that the key strategies I do for my mental health is, well, one is I see a therapist, and that once a week really helps me in a whole host of ways, professionally as well as personally. The other one, I have an activity. I play a lot of tennis as much as I can, but that's the one place when I'm on the tennis court, there's only if I have any chance of doing any way decent at tennis, I have to focus on it. So that blocks out all the other thoughts usually. So that's for me, that sort of getting that exercise is really, really important. And running, I do some running as well. So that's for my mental health and well-being. But crucially, also I've got lots of mentors, of friends and family who I can talk to, and I think that's key. Those informal bits that which are so important. And I've been really fortunate throughout my career to have really, really good mentors in that respect. And sadly, obviously, my first mentor obviously lost his struggle to live, but he was a remarkable person as well. And so I've been really lucky in that I've always made sure I have people I can speak to or connect to. So I suppose it comes back to that message of you're talking about the Holy Trinity. Well, you'd only say that, and you wouldn't say anyway, right? But it's looking after those. So mine, obviously, sleep. I've got better. I've got definitely sleep's got better. I make more time to sleep now, but I don't think I need as much as anyway. I can get on with that, but I do focus on making sure I get sleep, because exactly, you're right. The number of times we've all been there, in which you go, especially when I was writing this book, because all the writing most of it was at night time and then weekends. So then when I would go to bed at night, it's so difficult to turn off because it could be working until maybe. And I don't advocate this at all. It's not a good thing. But anyway, so I might be going to bed at 1 o'clock and have difficulty turning off, and then up for whatever 6 or 7 the next morning for work again. So that was challenging, but I knew that was only for a period of time. So the reason for saying that was, so anything which promotes a sense of control, because when we feel out of control, both mentally, physically, physiologically, socially, that's when pain starts. That's where all the pain comes from, or dysregulation comes from. So even though I was doing that ridiculous writing this book, I knew it was only for time limit. That's why I had some sense of control. So for everything in our life, anything which promotes control, that's what's key. Anything which reduces indecision and promotes control, that's good news. That's what I do. What about you? What do you do?
No, I'm going to say meaningful activity, Rory. You know, I think when you know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and you've got goals, you know, so if you think of the take 5 steps, keep learning and give, you know, and that makes you feel so good about yourself. So if you're focused on an activity that helps you give back to others and does some good in the world, and that sparks that curiosity in you and your learning, I think that protects your mental health. So yeah, no, I sleep lots though. I used to be like you, Rory. I thought I only need 7 hours, 6 hours. Now I've learned I can sleep for 10, 11 hours, and I will do it some nights, and it's so great because I run in the mornings, and when I run after a night's sleep like that, I can run really fast. And so but I have a really kind of chaotic life with a child, and you know, so I've got to squeeze things in. So I would be saying, like, even if you can do 10 minutes of physical activity every day, or maybe 10 minutes of yoga and then a wee 10-minute run, and I bought a treadmill. But like now I'm running outside more because it's summer, so I do lots of running, but I sleep a lot.
It's funny to sleep, because I can sleep. I definitely can't sleep as long now as 47-year-old, or no, 48-year-old I'm now. So I can't sleep. I used to be sleeping much better, but no, I'll still get, I'll probably get 6 or 7 hours. That's fine. But so I definitely can't sleep longer.
I can go right up to 9. I can do 8 most nights, and I used to do 7. So it's been a shift for me, but it's about going to bed early instead of sitting mindlessly, because my brain switches off. It's very hard for me to work at night. So if I have to do that, then I've been known to get up at 5:30 in the morning just to get a couple of hours work done before the child gets up. So that's how we all have these kind of rhythms that are different. Men and women are different as well, so there's all sorts of reasons for it that I'm learning about. But
the other one I was just going to say is also, mindfulness is another one. You mentioned yoga, but I just taking time to reflect, I think it's helpful daily, and I do some mindfulness, so I find that helpful. So obviously just focusing on your breathing and just trying to empty your mind of thoughts, but don't get annoyed if you can't. I think that's, again, to what mindfulness is about, again, is a sense of control. And then the other one is every day, try and think about, you talked about having purpose in life, and of course, and that's really, really great. But at the end of every day, think about, because we're much more likely to think at the end of every day the stuff that went wrong or a disagreement you had, but then also try and balance that with actually something will have gone right, and it doesn't matter how small that is, just try and focus on that. So it's just trying to just balance that, because we know that the mental tricks that the brain, they can play on you, and one of them is, we know from science and psychological research, is negative memories are much more likely to pop into your consciousness than positive memories when you're in a low mood. And so you've that, so that just compounds the problem. So that's why having some sort of routines, right, so important, as you said, and it was so important, I think, during the pandemic. And then that's social connectedness as well as the other one. It's just trying to have some sort of social connection. It doesn't matter where that is, who that is with, as long as it's constructive.
Yeah, the brain's designed to predict and protect. So if you've had a negative experience, the brain remembers that before you can even consciously remember it. So, it will remember every terrible thing you've ever done, and all of those good things are put to the side. So you need to wire in the good stuff. I do the gratitude diary. I have a mother's 5-year diary, a line a day that I write about good, and it's good stuff because it's for my child. So it focuses me on what I'm grateful for. And meditation, I've come back to that in the pandemic. And again, it's only every 10 minutes, and I don't necessarily do it every day, but that stillness, it's after she goes to sleep, that's when I do it, and try and just kind of, it's so good. But it helps you realize that you have control over your thoughts, and your thoughts aren't real. And as you say, once you have that level of control and you can control your thinking, then everything shifts, which reminds me about the Matt Haig, the Midnight Library. You can make more, you see the options in a clearer way and can make decisions that are completely different. So giving yourself that stillness.
Yeah, absolutely. I just one last. No, just one last thing. I was going to say, one way to end this, what I was going to think was, I was going to read the last paragraph from the book, because it ends with a message of hope. I hope, which a message of hope. So if you have anything else, I'll just end with it. Well, you can just do the wash up at the end. Yeah. So
perfect. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. So for those of you watching this, at the end of the book, once I finish the book, I've written an epilogue, which is sort of my reflections of writing the book, and it's like only 500 or 600 words. But so I'll just read the last paragraph of the book before there's a whole resources section and so on. But I'm hoping, because it gives a sense of, if you're still trying to get a sense of what the book's about or what I was trying to do, and that's message of hope, I'll just read that. So the last paragraph goes, I've also tried to dispel many of the myths that surround suicide, to illustrate the complex pathways from suicidal thoughts to suicidal acts, and what works to prevent suicidal behavior. And in doing so, I've tried to provide hope. Hope for those who've been suicidal, and hope for those who have been bereaved. Although we can never bring back those who we have lost, we can better understand, we can better support those left behind. And if we work together, we can save more lives. My ultimate hope is that as a society, if we are kinder and more compassionate, both to ourselves and to those around us, then we will go some distance in protecting all of us from the devastation of suicide. So I think, that's, in a nutshell, and whatever that is, 50 words, is a nutshell, I think, which sort of summarizes, I think, also our conversation here. And it just struck me when you said to protect, the brain is out to protect us. We're all trying to protect ourselves and each other from the devastation of suicide. That's the purpose of writing the book. That's the purpose of the work that we do in our day jobs each day, Siobhan. And I think it's, and hopefully people found it helpful.
Oh, that's perfect, Rory. That's really good. And also one of the things you should have said about self-care is having really good friends and having good chats with people, and people that are, you know, that you connect with. And I do lots of that. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in person again soon as well.
Something soon, yeah.
Lovely. But so thank you so much. Thanks for the book. First and foremost, you know, it's a labor of love for you, and that's very clear. But it will help so many people, Rory, like genuinely it will. And it's brilliant that you put it out there, that you put yourself out there and your own vulnerability out there too. That's really important that you've been able to do that. So thanks for that. And thanks for joining us today for this conversation. You know, squeezing these things in, it's never easy. So we're really grateful for your time. And thanks to Gas Yard Féile for helping put this out there as well, and for asking us to have this conversation. And thanks to everybody who's tuned in. You know, I hope it's of benefit. I would encourage you to get the book, or wait until the audiobook comes out, you know, to hear it being read.
Well, don't wait until the audiobook, because it may not happen.
May not happen. Okay.
Well, I don't know. It's not confirmed yet. That's means so it's still in, hopefully. But sorry, Siobhan, I interrupted your nice summary there.
You're all right. I'm used to it. No, I genuinely recommend the book. It's a really good book for anybody who's been through this, and for people who want to understand more. It's a really good read. So thank you so much, and we'll end it for now. And remember, Lifeline are there, 0808 808 8000, St Martin's 116 123. Thank you.
And then just my last bit is just thanks a million for the invitation as well, Siobhan, and thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with me. And I'm delighted to do it, because I'm a proud dairyman and ex-St Columns boy, and so I'm delighted to, and I'm looking forward to getting to dairy sometime soon, now that obviously the restrictions are lifted. Thank you very much, and goodbye.